Hi and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to keep watching Caesar. So this is Caesar versus Ariovistus, 58 BC. This is from Historia Civilis, I think it is. Yeah, Historia Civilis, right. And yeah, Caesar's interesting, Napoleon interesting, and then I think I'm going to also watch Alexander the Great. Some form of series or something about him, right? Alright. Original videos down below. Let's go.
Shortly after Caesar's victory over the Helvetii, he received
Yep.
a barrage of messages from Gallic tribes, thanking him for dealing with the invaders and congratulating him on his victory.
One thing though, I'm guessing that they would have done the same. A lot of the tribes, a lot of the Gauls would do the same thing to the Helvetii if they somehow defeated Caesar, right? Or pushed him back. And maybe some of the Gauls would go to Rome and ask for more help, right? Which would elevate Caesar even faster.
They then asked if they could come and see him in person. It was all quite mysterious, and they insisted that everybody take an oath of secrecy before the meeting. Once face to face, they told Caesar about a German king named Ariovistus. Apparently, Ariovistus had been invited across the Rhine by some Gallic tribe to intervene in a dispute, and had just started to gobble up territory for himself.
Which makes sense. And the Romans and Ariovistus had some form of communication, because I think we're going to see later on that Ariovistus is actually much more smarter than we think he is. He's not this, as the Romans portray the Germans and the Gauls as barbarians, right? Obviously they're not a unified empire like the Romans, and they don't have like citizenship, right? But Ariovistus knows his way around Rome. He knows like the political ins and outs somehow. It's not clear on why. I don't remember if he was ever in Rome, like the capital. Right, but this makes sense that he comes to fix or help with a dispute, right? You have a third party to help with a dispute. Happens pretty often, but then the third party comes and conquers one of the parties. Doesn't happen that often, but it happens.
He then began to bring large numbers of Germans across the Rhine in an effort to colonize his new territory.
Right.
He now had 120,000 Germans living in Gaul, with plans to bring more. As a cherry on top, Ariovistus had also attacked Rome's closest ally in Gaul, and had forced them to disavow their treaty with the Romans, and to provide an annual tribute to Ariovistus instead.
That was
Nobody
easy.
in Gaul was happy about this. The Gauls then got to the point of this secret meeting. They formally asked Caesar to intervene on their behalf. Caesar...
One thing though, would the Gauls, would they still do that? Like, they're upset of Ariovistus for invading and then colonizing whatever. But after Caesar, let's say that Caesar pushes back the Germans over the Rhine, right, east of the Rhine. Now the Gauls are going to be unhappy with how the Romans are treating them, and then they might call for another Germanic tribe to come in and help them against the Romans, right? So obviously everything is temporary, right?
Agreed to meet with Ariovistus to see if he could get him to moderate his behavior. I don't want to make it sound like Caesar was doing this for altruistic reasons. A law had been passed in 61 BCE instructing all governors of Transalpine Gaul to protect Rome's Gallic allies whenever they were able. In other words, Caesar had a mandate from Rome to act on this if he wanted to.
Sure.
But even more to the point, Ariovistus was encroaching on Rome's sphere of influence, and doing nothing in response would do some real damage to Rome's credibility in the region. Caesar sent a message to Ariovistus, asking for a meeting on neutral ground. Ariovistus wrote back, saying, "No, if you want to meet, come to me." Obviously, negotiations were off to a great start.
Yep.
Caesar sent a second message, reminding Ariovistus that Caesar had been the one to legitimize his rise to power during his year
There you
as
go.
consul. This
Yep.
was a not so veiled threat. He was saying, I made you, I could easily unmake you.
Yep.
Caesar then listed his demands. First, he instructed Ariovistus to immediately stop bringing Germans across the Rhine. Second, he instructed him to return all of his Gallic hostages. Third, he told him to immediately cease all military activity. Ariovistus sent a simple reply. He said that the Romans were free to run their conquests as they saw fit, and so was he. Cheeky.
I mean, can't argue with that, but again, or not again, but Ariovistus is attacking Rome's sphere of influence and close ally. So by extension, they're running their conquest on Rome, right? On Rome's territory.
Around the same time, Caesar also received two pieces of intelligence. First, he got word that Ariovistus had mobilized an army and was marching on his neighbors again. Second, he started to get reports of hundreds of thousands of Germans on the other side of the Rhine, preparing for a crossing. This was getting serious. Caesar gathered his men and set off towards Ariovistus. On the march, he got word that the German army was moving towards a town called Byzantio. This was bad. This town was well fortified, and Caesar wasn't interested in continuing negotiations with a guy behind strong walls, much less conducting a siege if it came to that. He left his supply wagons behind, and pushed his men forward at a breakneck pace, marching all day and all night, and arriving in Byzantio just before the Germans could reach it. He stayed there for several days, allowing his men to rest while his supply wagons caught up. When he was ready, Caesar marched out and closed in with Ariovistus' army. He sent messengers to set up a face-to-face meeting. Ariovistus had some specific ground rules for the meeting. He asked that exactly 10 men on horseback accompany each general. Caesar had cavalry, but they all happened to be Gauls, so fear...
I mean, I don't know how this is gonna go, right? Because, I mean, that's pretty specific. Could be an ambush, right? But I mean, you saw that Caesar were pretty quick to leave his supply lines, or wagons, and just get to the point, right? Get to the objective. Caesar is determined like
Fearing
that,
some sort of trap or betrayal, he had some of his most loyal infantry mounted on Gallic horses.
Makes sense.
This led to some of his men joking that he was treating them so well that he made them into equitae. If you don't get the joke, it's a pun. Equitae means both horsemen and a wealthy Roman.
Yep.
So the two generals and their retinues met on an open field. Caesar simply reiterated what he had told Ariovistus in his letter. He demanded that no more Germans cross the Rhine, that the Gallic hostages be returned, and the cessation of all military activities. Ariovistus said that this was now his province, just as Transalpine Gaul was Caesar's province. He said that he and the Romans had won their respective provinces through conquest, fair and square. Ariovistus then leveled a threat, saying that many politicians back in Rome would probably be overjoyed if he killed Caesar right now. Damn.
See? Ariovistus knows the political tension back in Rome somehow. Probably through ambassadors or whatever you want to call them, right? Probably, right? But I mean, that's true, right? We saw in the Caesar's year that there's a lot of people in the Senate that don't like Caesar, even though, you know, they're sort of similar to Caesar, but not in the military aspect, right? But that's a pretty big threat, right? Meaning, even if you defeat us, you're still lost, or something like that, right?
This comment caused a fight to break out between the horsemen. Caesar would say that the Germans started it, but he would say that, wouldn't he? Caesar immediately broke off negotiations and had his men return to camp. A few days later, Ariovistus...
I mean, let's think of this. If there were the Gauls on those horses, was Caesar going to be captured? Or killed, maybe.
This sent another message, saying that he was interested in another meeting. Caesar was understandably suspicious, considering how the last one ended.
Right.
He sent his favorite Gallic interpreter to go
Uh-oh.
and see what Ariovistus wanted. It's a good thing he did, because in fact it was a trap. Ariovistus took Caesar's interpreter prisoner and would spend the next several days arguing with his religious advisors over whether or not they should burn him alive as a
Wow.
religious sacrifice. Ariovistus mobilized his army, and in a surprise move marched all the way around Caesar's position and
Wow.
encamped on a hill behind him. This put him in a good position to intercept Caesar's grain shipments.
I mean, that is a very Caesar-esque move, right? This is what Caesar did against the Helvetii, right? Although he didn't continue the attack, but he took his best troops and they marched around to get on top of a hill, right? And he protected his own supply line. But here, he's outsmarted, right? But let's see what Caesar does to this, right?
Not great for Caesar. Ariovistus was leading an army of around 30,000, and Caesar had somewhere around 25,000.
Okay.
Caesar and Ariovistus both deployed for battle 5 days in a row.
Wow.
There was the occasional cavalry skirmish, but no outright attack. Caesar was now under pressure to attack before he ran out of food, and with Ariovistus holding the high ground, this was a recipe for disaster. So
It's true.
Caesar came up with a plan. He marched his army out of his camp in 3 columns, leaving a small garrison behind.
Smart.
He then marched just beyond the German hill.
Wow.
Ariovistus saw what he was doing and sent out his cavalry and half of his infantry in response. Why
Uh-oh.
only half? We'll get to that in a minute. Caesar had expected a German response, which is why he had his men in 3 columns rather than 1. He instructed 2 columns to turn and hold the Germans off, while the third one began to construct a fortified encampment.
Wow.
There was some skirmishing back and forth, but Ariovistus never really pushed in a coordinated attack, even though...
I mean, makes sense. But look at Caesar. He's building, again, Caesar and his engineers. And engineering, building forts, ditches, everything, walls. Quickly. And in important places where he needs them, right? He builds a fort there so he can protect his supply lines. And then he has a fort back where he left the troops, right? So basically, he has fortified his escape route and supply lines, right?
Though the Romans were out in the open and undeniably vulnerable. When the third line completed its construction, the Romans pulled back and the Germans didn't pursue.
Yep.
Caesar was now in a position where he could intercept his food shipments unmolested, which meant that he could take his time figuring out how to deal with Ariovistus. The next day was pretty uneventful, but late in the day, the Germans sent a raiding party to attack the first Roman camp. But Caesar had left a garrison and they were easily repulsed. During this engagement, some German prisoners were captured. Under questioning, they revealed that Ariovistus had been told by his religious advisors that victory was impossible until the next full moon.
Wow.
Aha! That explains why he was being so cautious. Caesar decided to take full advantage of this. The next day, he marched his army straight up the hill, and Ariovistus did not challenge him.
I mean, this is pretty common, that military leaders look for something else to like see if you're going to succeed in a battle. I mean, the Romans do this as well, right? I think they did it in the first Punic War. Yeah, in the first Punic War, they throw the sacred chickens. They wait for like lightning to strike or something like that, right? But I mean, to affirm their belief in the coming battle, right?
Now
Nothing
both
new.
armies were on the hill. Caesar then deployed for battle, so close to the German camp that they had no choice but to fight. If you remember back to when Caesar fought the Helvetii, he had kept his 2 inexperienced legions in reserve at all times. Here, for the first time, he put them up front, which is a sign of their growing competence. As Ariovistus' army prepared for battle, Caesar observed that the Germans on the Roman right looked a little weak. That's where he positioned himself, and that's where he intended to win the battle.
Makes sense.
All of a sudden, the Germans attacked with amazing speed. It all happened so fast that the Romans didn't even have time to throw their javelins. They just had
Wow.
to drop them where they stood. Caesar ordered his first 2 lines forward and kept his third in reserve.
Okay.
Ariovistus fought with some pretty unusual tactics, which are worth getting into here.
His infantry and cavalry coordinated very closely and were organized in mixed groups of 100. The infantry
Smart.
acted as a solid wall, similar to a phalanx, while the cavalry would hide behind them and launch hit-and-run attacks, coming back to regroup when needed. Each group acted independently, which meant that there were hundreds of hits and runs going on at the same time.
Yeah, that's
It
pretty
was
smart.
extremely frustrating to deal with.
I mean, it's like the Romans later on, right? They have their shields, and then when the person is tired, they whistle, and then they attack with their sword, I think, and then pull back, and then a new guy comes in front, right? Sort of similar, right?
As the battle dragged on, the Roman frustration started to show. Some dealt with the German walls of infantry by throwing themselves into them and ripping away the enemy's shields with their bare hands. I ain't never seen that in a movie.
Yeah, that's
After
gutsy.
some effort, Caesar was able to break through on the Roman right, just as he had planned. But with all of his attention devoted here, he was unaware that at the same moment, the Roman left was beginning to crumble. The commander of the Roman cavalry, Publius Licinius Crassus, son of Caesar's political ally, saw what was happening and launched into action. On his own accord, he went to the Roman third line, who were totally oblivious, and ordered them to come and reinforce the Roman left.
Wow.
The third line got there just in time, and the left held. This was an early example of the growing initiative of Caesar's subordinates, which would turn out to be a feature of the Gallic Wars.
I mean, and it's why Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and Caesar are one of the greats, right? They have good subordinates who obviously need Caesar's and Alexander Great and Napoleon's sort of instructions, but they also can do stuff on their own, right? They're competent.
Soon afterwards, the German collapse on the right reverberated throughout the entire army. The Germans fell apart and fled. They continued their retreat all the way back across the Rhine, pursued by a horde of angry Gauls.
Wow.
Those hundreds of thousands of Germans waiting to cross the Rhine heard news of this defeat and went home. As luck would have it, after the battle, Caesar's favorite Gallic interpreter was found alive, but traumatized by the constant conversations about being burned alive.
Yeah.
Caesar would later say that discovering that he was alive gave him as much pleasure as the victory itself.
Okay.
With these back-to-back victories over first the Helvetii and then Ariovistus, Caesar would later say that he won 2 wars in a single summer.
Yeah.
Rome was now well established as an indispensable power broker in the region.
That's
Caesar
true.
left his army in Gaul under the command of Labienus for the winter, and returned to his provinces to tend to his duties as governor. He'd be back next spring.
Wow. Alright, that was cool. Right? Short but sweet. I mean, Caesar's later on going to capture Ariovistus in a battle, and they're going to have a triumph, and then at the end of the triumph they strangle Ariovistus, I think, in Rome, which you usually did, right? On a triumph you had the leaders of the armies that you fought in like cages or dragging them on the street and then execute them at the end. Yeah, but this was great, and we're going to keep watching Caesar on the rise in Gaul and in different places. Alright, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.